So welcome to the Designing Your Career panel on how to ace a data technical interview. Want to congratulate you for taking the initiative for coming here, because this means that you're serious about this data path and this kind of interview. And so there's a lot of great info today on getting you to feel more comfortable and like getting exposure to it. But before we go into that, I want to do a little bit of intro so you're not like, who are these strangers talking to you? But I'm Angie, and I'm working on the data program here at PadStream. I'm joined today by Andy, who's a data scientist and career coach for PadStream, and Brooke, who's our technical learning experience designer at PadStream. And you're going to hear from them a lot more throughout today's session. And Brooke's going to be on the chat today, so you'll be interacting with her there. So today's goal, we're going to equip you with frameworks and tips, and also practice questions to effectively and confidently ace a data technical interview. We know that some of you may have never interacted or never had practice with data technical interviews. Some of you have and just want more practice. So this is really just a great way to get kind of experience for both. And this is the agenda for today. So starting just with kind of the basics of what is a technical interview, what are the types of technical interviews, then jumping into frameworks and tips, then going into the actual mock technical interviews. And we're going to need your participation to kind of debrief on how those went. And then finally, that audience Q&A. So starting off, what is a technical interview? A technical interview is meant to assess you on your technical knowledge. So not just like any technical knowledge, but specifically any technical skills that are necessary for the job you're applying for. But if we want to get more into the specifics, it's also more generally on your ability to problem solve. So if you've ever had a technical interview, ever wanted to try preparing for one, you may have noticed they kind of come in all shapes and sizes, but some of the most common ways you will be assessed for your technical skills are by a direct technical question and answer, an online live coding interview, or some other types that are common, but maybe not for today's session, are whiteboard interviews or technical take-homes. Again, there are many, many more, and it really depends on the company you're applying for, but these are some of the most common we've seen. For today's session, we're going to be focusing on the direct technical Q&A and the online live coding, which are some of the most popular you'll run into, and that also kind of overlap with some of the other ones. But if you've never heard of the direct technical question and answer, this type of interview involves an interviewer asking you to describe some sort of technical concept and try to evaluate your understanding of that concept based on the quality of your answer. So it's almost like if you took a regular behavioral type of interview, but now changed the topics of that behavioral to your technical concepts. If you're ever wondering, hey, what kind of questions are in here? How should I prep? Again, it depends on the interview or the job posting itself, what kind of skills you're assessing. But some of the most common types of questions we've seen for data roles are these questions on the screen. And there really are so many practice questions online, but yes, these are example questions for a direct technical Q&A. The other really popular type of interview in a technical interview is an online live coding interview. So this is an interview that's typically virtual, even before the pandemic, where you will be asked to complete coding problems for a data role that's typically SQL, sometimes Python, sometimes R, and it's in a shared environment like CoderPad, if you've ever heard of that. sometimes like Google Docs. And you will be assessed on like your live coding by a tech interviewer. And the image on the screen is an example of what it could actually look like. So you'll be on something like Zoom or some sort of video interview setup. And then that layout right there is CoderPad. And they have a couple questions where you can type out your code. And this is example questions of what that could actually look like. So it's a little bit different than the direct technical Q&A because this now involves you typing out the code itself. So for example, this would involve you typing out SQL queries. Your question has 2 tables, and then from those 2 tables, you need a table result, right? So it has more general type of questions that would require interaction from the 2 interviewers for you to be able to kind of showcase those SQL skills. So you may be wondering, why a technical interview? Shouldn't my experience say for itself how good I am at this, right? Well, these interviews don't necessarily model the day-to-day tasks you might perform on the job, but they will assess your knowledge of the fundamentals, also how you approach a problem and break it down to find a solution. And many times getting the perfect, most optimal solution in like a live coding or whiteboard interview isn't the most important thing in the interview as much as it is showing an effective approach to your problem solving. So I've known some people to go as far as not knowing maybe the language for a particular, the technical language for a particular role, and still doing pretty well on an interview because they were able to problem solve to an answer. But again, that might have been for a more complex problem. So this right here is a quote from an interviewer about just the types of people they're excited to interview, right? So the people I'm most excited to place in jobs are the people that are most excited to talk to me. So just giving you the outsider perspective into these technical interviews and knowing that it can be a little bit intimidating when you're going into this different type of interview that, you know, not many people have gotten the experience to kind of go to until it's happening. But that technical interviewers do like it when people are excited to come to these interviews. But now we're actually going to go into some good stuff, the technical interview framework and tips. And I'm going to pass it over to Andy, who's going to cover some tips for the direct technical Q&A.
All right, thank you, Angie. So yeah, like Angie said, I'm going to cover a couple of technical Q&A tips. And just like what Angie said at the very beginning, don't worry, if you have any questions, you can drop them down and ask the questions at the very end of the Q&A session, okay? So please, the next slide. So, so first of all, practice. Now, you have to keep in mind that there's no shortcut when it comes to technical interviews. In fact, I actually spent like more than half year to prepare for my first job in tech, like after my graduation. And so I can't stress enough how important it is to practice your crafts in order to start your career in tech. So one obvious suggestions for you guys is to practice mock interview questions that are available online. Make sure you are not only studying these questions by heart though, but also you want to literally speak it up, pretend that you are actually in an interview settings. That way you can learn how to control your flow and the thought process during the actual interview. Okay. Also, don't forget that past streams, career service provides you access to the mock interviews training sessions. We got to assign you a career coach and guide you step by steps on how to ace your technical interview. So that would be pretty important. Thanks. So the number 2 tips for you guys would be prepare your examples in advance. And one misconception from most of the interviewees is that technical interview does not require examples to back up your response, which is not true. For example, like when you are asked whether you know about VLOOKUP from Excel, instead of saying you know about that function and describe the function itself, it's actually even better for you to tell the interviewer that how you actually applied VLOOKUP from your job or from your training in a past stream. So that way, you make a more convincing case to the interviewer that you are capable of doing the technical skills that he asked you in specific. And therefore, like when you prepare for technical questions next time, make sure you can think of like 1 to 2 work examples that you could relate to the question. So yeah, VLOOKUP, then you might want to think about what you have learned from past stream. That would be one example. And if you have done it from your actual job in the past, that will be another example. So things like that. Okay, steps. So number 3 is actually echoing the previous slide when I talk about examples. And the one convenient way, and I would say like the best way to kind of like brainstorm some ideas on what kind of examples that you want to demonstrate during the when you want to talk about examples to interviewers is by using the STAR method. And STAR, in case you don't know, that actually means 4 different steps: situation, task, action, and result. So and you can see from the slides that we actually want to break it down the time management in terms of time management. That's how you break down all 4 sessions when it comes to responding in STAR method. So we've got to say like 20% of the time we talk about a situation. So the situation could be like back to the VLOOKUP examples. You may say like there's once your manager asks you to do a data auditing between 2 different tables. And one way to do it is by using VLOOKUP to search for the columns that you want to do the comparison. And that will be the situation. And next, that will be 10% of the time you want to talk about the task. And back to the VLOOKUP examples, that would be like I said, do you want to use VLOOKUP to do the data comparison? And then how you actually compare that? That would be the task for yourself to do that. Okay, and that should be pretty brief. And because I want you to spend more time on actually talk about the actual action. And by the way, like people usually get a little bit confused between task and action. And I'm gonna be honest with you, it's okay to actually combine them together to talk about it in one session. That means like task, like usually people differentiate between task and action. Task is something that is all about the purpose and what you feel like you're gonna do, and the action will be the reality, like what you actually have done to accomplish that. So sometimes it's okay to kind of mix them up a little bit. I would prefer you to do that in fact sometimes, like to give yourself more flexibility. And the key here is to make sure that you provide as much detail as possible about the task and action. And back to the VLOOKUP example, action, that will be like, how is it probably going to be different from the task itself? Maybe you can talk about like the challenges that you have seen. For example, when you do the VLOOKUP, there's some entities, some rows of data they are missing some information that that couldn't allow you to do the VLOOKUP properly. So you have to do some extra work to do that. So, and then another example would be like how you do the data pre-processing. Like there could be some disconnect between the two different databases that you need to do something in advance in order to do the VLOOKUP properly. So that will be the actual actions that you have done. Okay. And then finally, result. It should be pretty brief to talk about like what actually you accomplish at the very end, and lesson that you've learned. That will be another important thing that you want to talk about, and like the impact to the organization or to the team. That will be something also worth mentioning. Okay, next. And finally, remember, slow down. It's very common actually to see interviewees speak way too fast when they are nervous. So make sure that you control your pace. Listen carefully to your interviewer. And remember, if you have followed the first 3 steps that I just mentioned, you should be totally ready for the technical interview. So don't panic and relax, because you got this. Okay. Another common difficulty people usually come across during an interview is they got frustrated when they don't know the answer of a specific tech concept. So that is pretty common. I personally have come across that like almost every time when I have technical interview with tech companies. So it's normal, but so that is why it's actually important to prepare yourself to have like a right script to respond in that kind of situation. So you may say something like, I do not have any formal experience with a specific tech concept, and right here maybe I will use SQL. Okay, I don't have any formal experience with SQL, but from my understanding, it is a data management and processing software that could allow you to not only integrating different databases together, but also do any slice and dicing of the data into the right formats that you desire. So I believe I'm able to close the gap by using Excel. That would be one way to do it if the database is not too massive. And additionally, I'm a fast learner, as demonstrated by my previous examples that I talk about during the interview, and also you can find it out in my resume. And of course, if it's a major requirement of this job, then I commit to pick up the SQL language before I start the job. So, that would be how you actually gonna respond when you are asked a technical skill set that you don't know. Okay. And one last thing, when you need more time to respond, instead of being silent, it's actually always a good practice to tell the interviewer that you need more time to collect your thoughts. In fact, like I personally would ask for like, can you give me a little bit of time? Like every single time when I'm asked a question. So it doesn't matter whether I already know the answer or not. I just actually need some time to gather my thoughts and think of the best examples that I could provide before I jump into answering the question. Okay, next. So now let's switch gear to online live coding. Angie, please.
Thanks, Angie. And that was a lot of great information. So now switching it up to tips specifically for online live coding. So you can also apply a lot of the tips that Andy discussed in like this online live coding situation as well, but you'll notice that some of these are a little bit more specific to this kind of, I want to say like situation scenario. So let's go ahead and get started with these 5 tips. So the first one, you may see a trend here, but take your time. Initially, you may get a little bit nervous, want to jump right in, just start typing the code immediately. But I wouldn't recommend that, especially if you aren't entirely aligned on what the question is asking you, like what it is that you're trying to solve. Make sure there's no, like, I don't want to say tricks, but any kind of caveats that might be in there. Like, you definitely want to make sure you clarify anything that they might be trying to get you with before you go ahead and jump into the question itself. This also looks really good to the interviewer, making sure that you just kind of take a step back, assess the question, assess your thoughts. It also might just help you, get a little bit of time before you jump right in. So take your time. It's normal and it looks good before you jump into coding itself. The other thing, use a framework. So we love frameworks here. Frameworks are going to love you. They're going to make it a lot simpler to organize your thoughts, especially when there's just a lot going on. But one of the frameworks that we really like for these types of interviews are these following 4 steps. So it's broken down into initially understand what it is you're being asked of you. Number 2, plan your approach. 3, break each step into the smallest parts possible. And then if you get stuck, take a minute to reassess what you've already done. So specifically, the first one, we already kind of discussed it, but I think the main idea here is try not to make any assumptions about what you are being asked. Just clarify. Because, like I mentioned before, you never know if, like, the assumption is what makes the question wrong, or that's where they are trying to make you take a different approach. So just ask the question, even if it seems relatively simple. Number 2, plan your approach. Feel free to write out your steps before you solve your problem, before writing your code. I've seen some people do that as part of that initial take a minute or two to plan your approach or to kind of gather your thoughts. So feel free to do that for you if that works, especially as you're writing notes or jotting down whatever your interviewer is telling you about the question. That can be part of it. Number 3, when you're breaking down things into the smallest parts possible, it makes it easier to not look at it almost like a monster problem, right? Especially with something like SQL. When they're broken down into smaller, more digestible pieces, it becomes smaller, more foundational types of queries to write. So if you find those little pieces, take them, write them, and then you can kind of bring them all together to make that larger problem. So yeah, break down a problem whenever you can. And then it's okay to feel stuck because you can kind of take a minute to reassess what you've already done and kind of go like step by step with it and verbalize that with your interviewer. So they can kind of see your problem solving and kind of how you get unstuck. Talking about verbalizing that with your interviewer, don't forget to talk. This is a really, really big one for these online live coding interviews or any kind of coding interview. So when you're in the zone, maybe coding, it may not seem natural to just start talking about what you're doing. This can really, really help you in the interview process as you're solving your problem. So essentially, if let's say there's this giant gap of silence as you're trying to think through your solution, the interviewer can't read your mind. So you're going to want to like talk about what you're thinking. So maybe you're thinking of doing this approach or this approach instead. Say it out loud so that your interviewer can kind of know what it is that's going on right now. Sometimes they will even try to kind of guide you in like the better approach, especially if they see that that's like something that they'd appreciate from their future employee, right? So they can give you hints as you're talking it through. They're essentially interested in that breaking down process. So this is a really great tip for you and kind of earns you brownie points. One thing to keep in mind if you're like, I don't know how to do this doesn't come like natural to me, is kind of pretend that you're teaching the interviewer almost, like what you're doing. And so that way it becomes a little bit more natural around like showing them almost step by step so that they could follow along as opposed to you in the middle of an interviewer. So think of it like, what would a teacher share with their student as they're working through an example? I think that's a really great way to think about it as you're going through that interview. So don't forget to talk. And then number 4, keep it simple. So don't worry about having the most beautiful, fancy, optimal type of solution in your code for this type of interview, especially if it's more entry level. If you're applying for a more senior type of role, that might be a different type of discussion, but for like an entry level analyst role, honestly, if you're going more towards like the, I don't want to say correct approach, but like towards a more positive solution, then I would say that is better as opposed to like something fancy that's going to break. So I would say keep it simple. If you are more familiar with joins versus like subqueries, but you really want to test out subqueries in that moment, maybe right now is not the moment. So just go with what you're more familiar with. And then number 5, the reason I was iffy to use a word like correct or perfect is because your code doesn't always need to be 100% perfect. So the reason this is the way it is because sometimes, let's say you're forgetting like a semicolon or there's like a typo or something like that in the middle of an interview. And if this were to run in your actual environment, it would error, right? That is usually okay. If there's like a big concept that you got off, that's like, oh, this person is not familiar with SQL at all, that won't look so good. But interviewers are also understanding that like this is not the typical environment that you'd be coding in from day to day. So as long as you can talk through the problem and showcase that like you'd be essentially good if you could run through this one more time, it doesn't need to be 100%. Now, keep in mind, if it is a very foundational, simple question and you get it wrong, that's kind of something else also. In that case, they won't be as lenient. I would say this is more for those like questions that are more on the medium to hard scale. That's when they have a little bit more flexibility. Okay, we're moving on to the fun stuff. So the mock technical interview. So for this portion, we're actually going to run through a couple mock technical interviews so you can kind of see what it actually would look like if you were in the interview itself. And so for this first mock technical interview, we're going to do a direct technical question and answer focused on Excel, Google Sheets. And this is actually the question. But for this question, I'm going to role play as an interviewer, and Andy is going to role play as our interviewee. And before we go ahead and get started, I want you guys to kind of look for these things in Andy's response. So you will recognize these because these are actually the tips from direct technical Q&A. But yes, I want you to see if you can identify any of these in his response, and then we can debrief afterwards. But we can go ahead and get started. So Andy, can you tell me what features of Excel or Google Sheets you have used for data cleaning?
Mhm. Sure. Before I answer the question, I want to clarify something first. So there's a little bit of differences between Excel and Google Sheets. So I want to make sure that you are okay for me to use examples that like a functionality from both software that is actually applicable from both software, if that's okay for you.
That works for me. Thank you for clarifying.
All right. Thank you so much. So please give me a brief moment to think about like what would be the good example that I should demonstrate. Okay, I'm ready. The features that I usually use would be VLOOKUP and pivot table. One of the examples that I've done is to deal with Airbnb data. And right there, I need to integrate the Airbnb sales data to the Airbnb regional data. So the goal here is to join both database so that I can eventually aggregate the regional sales information and transform it into a time series of data. So the end product I'm expecting to see would be month over month, the total sales in let's say West Coast, and then another one would be East Coast, things like that. So that would be the task that I'm going to give myself to do. And by doing that during the VLOOKUP process, I noticed that there's some missing information in the sales data. So I need to do some data pre-processing, including to make sure that I either like delete some of the missing rows of data, or I need to think of a automation way to join the database correctly. So for example, like if I don't have the city information from the sales transaction data, so maybe I can go up one level to look at the state level of data and take an average of it and use that as part of the database I'm going to do the pivot table from. So these are the pre-processing that I've done. And after that, then once I confirm the data quality of the joint database is ready to go, then I use pivot table to transform the data into a time series and use the region column as an additional filter to dissect the database into different categories. In that case, the region, and create graphs and also KPIs for the analysis that I'm asked to do. And eventually, I was able to identify fluctuations of some missing data, or like in some specific regions, there's a huge drop in the sales, and I was able to identify them. I reported back to my manager.
Awesome. So now we're going to go through essentially almost like assessing Andy's response, and I'm going to need your guys' help for this. So in the chat, I'd love if you can kind of help me as we go one by one with this and help me answer if we feel like he used some of the following tips, right? So for the first one, do we feel like Andy had enough practice beforehand with the concepts he was asked about in this question? And just a little yes or no or thumbs up, whatever you had. Yes, yes. Andy, I guess you passed that one. So we're good.
Thank God.
I know. Wait, great. Okay, great. For the next one, can anyone give me just like an example of one of the examples he used in his response that was like an example that he had used in his past that was related to this question? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So yeah, he related it back to his Airbnb data, VLOOKUP, and pivot tables. He explained how he used a pivot table to transform the data into a time series by region, pivot tables. Andy, are there any more that you wanted to call out that you're like, hey guys, this one's really important? Why did you forget that one?
No, I think you all captured the important parts, like the missing value, the slicing, dicing of the data into like time series data. So these are the things I try to emphasize in my response.
Yeah, I think that's great. Similarly to the first question with a yes or no response, do we feel like Andy used the STAR method to answer this question? And if you need a little refresher, situation, task, action, result. Ooh, Andy, someone called you out. They said SAR.
Yeah, that is exactly what I mentioned as well. Like for some scenarios, like task and action, it could be messed up a little bit. It's fine. It all depends on like how the task and action actually vary from each other.
And then last question. Did it feel like he properly answered the question in a appropriate way? Like all aspects of the question, I guess. Yes. Yeah. I guess you passed, Andy. 4 out of 4 for this one.
Yeah. So one quick thing I want to add on to though is remember at the very beginning, I actually asked Angie some questions before I jump into it and give myself some time to gather my thoughts. I hope that you guys actually notice that and keep that in mind when you actually do your interview trip.
Yeah. That was a really good call out, Andy. Notice he prepped me for the like silence, because if he would have just like kept a blank silence beforehand, that would have been a little bit awkward. So yes, prepare them for anything in advance. But I think we can go ahead and move to the next question. So for the sake of time, we're actually going to skip the second question and move on to the third. But if you were curious about this one, that's this question. We can send off our like model response afterward. But for the third question, it's actually going to be a sequel question, and it's going to be an online live technical question. And for this question, we want you to use the following tips. Try to identify them in his response. So these are the same tips you saw for the online live coding. But for this, we're actually going to step out of this deck and go into an environment that you typically see in this kind of interview. Give me 1 second. I think it's loading. There we go. Okay, and as you can see, there's a little comment on this side that has the tips, just so you can kind of keep them in your mind as Andy's going through this. So Andy, as you can see, there are 2 tables on the screen. If you can please go ahead and answer the following question using SQL.
Sure, Angie. But before I start, some quick question to clarify about the database themselves before I go on. First of all, for the employee's ID, can I assume that they are unique? That means like there won't be any duplication.
That is right. The employee ID is a primary key in this case.
Thank you. And for same as the project ID at the project table, is that a unique key?
That is correct.
Okay. And I will assume that the MID and the employee ID from both tables, they are talking about the same thing, which is the employee ID.
Correct.
Cool. And okay, cool. So the question is looking into the 5 highest paid employees who have completed 100 projects. One last question that I probably would ask is that, do you mind if I use subquery to write my answer?
Yes, you can use
Okay.
subquery.
Okay, cool. So I'm gonna go ahead and do that. From projects, join, employee on employee ID equals to B and ID. So highest paid employees. Oh, okay, cool. So then right here, first of all, I want to do MID, salary, and count, distinct, project ID, total projects. So Angie, let me walk you through what I'm doing so far. So first of all, there's obviously 2 information I need to get from you, which is this the salary of each employee, which is already given by from the employees table. And the goal here is to actually identify employees that also complete 100 projects. So that is why at first I need to do a row count of the total projects per employee. And that is how I'm creating my query so far. Employee ID and the salary. And you may curious, like, why do I put employee ID and salary there? And that is actually a quick follow-up questions I want to ask you about is, I know that employee ID is unique in employees table. And can I also assume that each employee will only have 1 rows of data in the employees data table? That means each employee will only have 1 salary number.
That's correct.
Okay, cool. So in that case, it's fine for me to do a group by this way. So after that, I would say do a having, and then I was having function so that I can do the limit the employees that have more than 100 have completed more than 100 projects. So in that case, count project ID that will be 100. So that would give you the all the employees that have the completed 100 projects. And now the question would be like, how can we do the top 5? So there's 2 ways I can do it. I can either do like a ranking among the employees based on the projects, or actually by the salary, and be done with it. Or I can just do like a limit of rows to do that. So both ways should be fine, but for the sake of this exercise, let me actually do the ranking here. So I'm gonna say here, what would be the addition by MID, salary, order by salary. And right here, I It's actually a bit ugly, so I'm gonna. Rewrite would be, so if it's ascending order, that would be less than 5. So that would be the final answer.
Thanks for writing this down, Andy. You guys, for the sake of time and because Andy is a pro, we're gonna just jump right into the debrief. And here, let's go in here. But thank you for doing that, Andy. I would love if everyone can participate as well. We're gonna not do the first one, but actually I am curious about how people felt about how much Andy talked. So do we feel like he talked enough, not enough, or like could do more? How did people feel on a scale of like how much communication was involved? Oh, okay, we got a not enough.
Mm-hmm.
Just one. Enough, okay. You guys don't have to comment this, but I'm curious if, like, as you're comparing it to if you've done a technical interview, like how it compares to maybe how much you've talked in your interviews. So I think it could be interesting to also compare there. Enough, he was very thorough. Yeah, so I would say actually from my experience with having done my own technical interviews and interviewed others, like I think the way he talked through it was like at a really good kind of level. I think he took time to kind of assess independently, but also didn't leave me hanging when like he was actually going through the whole thing. So if you can speak that much, I think that would be perfect.
Yeah, let me add a little bit comment on that too. So yeah, it is true. And by the way, I actually didn't do the coding beforehand, so I literally do it from like right in front of you. So and that is common actually to have people kind of like space out and not talking much at the middle, especially like you see that I went silent a little bit at the middle of the time because that was the time that I actually need to process how the data is actually aggregated, is it in the right way, or what would be the next step. So that was fine. Even when I interview people, I feel okay to actually to have a little bit of silence at that time. And one thing I should have done a little bit better though is at the very end, I just summarize everything that I've done there. So my apologies, I didn't actually mention that, but take that as an example. You probably want to kind of like summarize what you have typed at the very end.
I also saw a really great comment that Penny wrote. It says, I know it takes time, but it would be kind of cool if you commented out the steps in the code to show the framework. I think
Yep.
that would be helpful, not just to like our audience, but also as you're kind of organizing your thoughts to your interviewer, that can be a really great way to kind of showcase what you're doing. So yeah, wanted to put that out there, but let's actually move right along. So really quickly, if you're interested in taking the next step in your career, we do have our Pathstream programs if you're not a part of them already. So pathstream.com/programs. And we do have upcoming career workshops. So our next one is how to break into digital marketing, in case you've ever been interested in marketing analytics, perhaps. And then I know we only have a couple minutes left, but definitely wanted to open it up to audience Q&A. So I think we can go ahead and get started. There are a couple of questions in the Q&A, but if you have any other questions, please type them in and we'd love to help you out. So our first question is, when do we get assigned a career coach? So first you have to opt into career services, and typically you get the option to opt in. I believe it's like at the beginning of the last course in your certificate. So if you haven't had the option, let me know, or not let, email us and we can talk about that. And it says, another question, if the job position states that it is entry level, what level of SQL are they looking for? And actually, I want to pass this on to Andy.
So for entry level, I would say like you need to demonstrate your ability to use joins, the different joins, left join, right join, outer join. So that will be one major thing. And then the other one would be like aggregation, like transforming the data, like the Airbnb example I just mentioned. How do you actually transform the data into a time series? Using group by would be the common, and you probably want to also know how to use the function called having to filter out the right the only data that you need for the, after the aggregated data. So that will be the two major things that you need to demonstrate when it comes to like an entry level data analytics job.
Great. Any other questions?
Angie, I had a question. As I was watching you demonstrate answering questions, one of the things that we talked about was sort of taking your time, pausing, and trying to be thoughtful. Is it okay for you to take notes? This is something that I've done in past interviews, not coding interviews, but I like to have a paper and pen, so it slows me down. Is that an okay thing to do during a technical interview?
Absolutely. I've seen people taking notes or typing it out even. So either way is fine. And one heads up though is make sure that you mention you tell the interviewer that you are taking notes, or you type it out in advance, like at the very beginning of the interview. Then it should be okay.
Andy, I think Morgan wants a clarification on what was the other function that we need to know for entry-level data analysts for SQL.
So like I said, joins, group by, having, and then the where across, so that you know how to filter out the right data. And finally, I would say like your ability to use the right amount of subqueries to kind of like slice and dice in the data. I think that should cover everything.
Yeah, that sounds about right. And as we're wrapping up, a question I get a lot of times is like, when is the technical interview? Like as part of the interview process, and that can vary per company, but I think it's important to kind of ask your, is it like recruiter, whoever is the first person who got in contact with you, to kind of run you through kind of what the typical interview process looks like for that role. You're allowed to do that. Also, you're allowed to ask like who's interviewing you or what to do to best prepare for an interview. And so as much info as you can get before an interview, try to get it in like an email or anything. So just a heads up that they do vary in terms of like, oh, will it be first? Will it be third? Will it be whatever? Usually it's not first, by the way. But yeah, just something to keep in mind, that you can get as much info as you can and then try to do research on whoever's interviewing you on LinkedIn to, you know, get that kind of info beforehand. So
one quick note, sorry, Angie. It's actually getting more popular for companies to assign you like we call it a take-home quiz. Take it back home and do the technical interviews. Like they're probably going to give you an Excel. You have to solve some problems and then send it back to them within 24 hours. So that happens as well. And Angie, I'm not sure, like past year, whether we actually provide any support on that. So I would let you answer that.
Yeah, so like technical quizzes, technical take homes. So we have one of our projects in the course that's like focused on kind of like a replica of what that would be. Also, if you're a part of career services, you get access to the little data analyst interview prep course that has a whole focus on technical take home. So practice, the types of questions, and essentially exposure to what you would get. But, so again, just a little plug about passstream.com/programs.
And Angie, really quickly, Penny had a comment in the chat about
Let's see.
transferable skills. Yeah, and Andy's phrase. I think that's nice to highlight that for our audience.
Oh yeah, that's really nice. Thanks, Penny. So yeah, if you guys like those templates, you will get the recording so that you can essentially copy those templates in your interviews. So please use them all. We really encourage you to do so. But hope you guys learned a lot today. Good luck with your technical interviews, and we're really excited for you. If you haven't signed up for career services yet, please do so. If you haven't signed up for Passstream programs, please do so. And yeah, hope you have a great rest of your day, night, whatever it is where you're at. And thank you so much for your time today.